This is James McRussell Lamb with the Power to Change broadcast. This is the last week in Black History Month that we're going to be covering Black history for this year. And we've gone over a number of subjects. If you've not had the opportunity to hear our broadcast, you can both see and hear it on Facebook and on YouTube. If you missed any of the previous broadcasts, we have talked in our African History Month about Martin Luther King and his view on other religions that had effect on Christianity, even going back into Egypt and their history. We talked about the bones called Dinkanesh, Thou Art Beautiful, which were found by an African man, later changed into the bones called Lucy, that gives us our ancestry of millions of years that we've been on the face of the earth. Yes, we are the mothers and the fathers of the entire planet. We talked about the kingdoms of Songhai, Mali, and Ghana to offset the ideas that the Europeans came and got savages out of the jungle and brought them over to America and made them into slaves. No, they robbed communities, mothers and fathers and others who lived in rural areas and had a society and a community together. So we want to offset that idea that we were savages in Africa. We talked about Kemet, the original name of Egypt, which means land of the blacks. And we talked about their contributions, their massive contributions in science and history and astrology and astronomy and architecture and mathematics and geometry and history and all kinds of areas of science that we have given to the world. We talked about Greece and Rome and how they have benefited from the knowledge that evolved out of Africa. And this week we're going to be talking about the Moors. During the European Dark Ages, between the 7th and the 14th century, the Moorish Empire in Spain became one of the world's finest civilizations. The population was 90% illiterate, that is, the European civilization was 90% illiterate and had lost all of their civilizing principles that were passed on by the ancient Greeks and Romans. It was the African Moors in Spain who preserved the academic exploits of Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates, as well as Christianity. Africans not only preserved these Greek intellectual ideas, but tutored Europeans after the Dark Ages and were responsible for their eventual historic glory. The credit, of course, has not been given to black people in the history books that our children are given. In fact, Africa was treated with a total exclusion from all forms of media except for negative views, and that's even true today. Whenever you see pictures of Africa, you see warlords and torn areas and starvation, but there are beautiful cities in Africa. There is a beautiful, thriving community that you never see. And we're always relegated to being barbaristic and savage. That is why it is absolutely crucial and so very important that we reclaim our past glories. Knowledge of the truth of African accomplishments must take its correct place in the history of the world. This truth and this truthful historical position puts Africans first and at the beginning of creating the world's first civilizations. If we as Africans fail to do all that now, all the attempts for the total liberation and necessary empowerment of African people will come to nothing. That is the monument that we owe to our ancestors of the Middle Passage. We are the survivors of that voyage. To not take action and make something of their sacrifice will mean it was all useless, that all of their prayers, their blood, their sweat, and their tears meant nothing. The Moors introduced to Europe, listen to this now, paved, lighted streets with raised sidewalks for pedestrians, flanked by uninterrupted rows of buildings, paved and lighted streets. They did not appear in London or Paris for hundreds of years after that. The Moors, they constructed thousands of public markets and mills in each city. Cordova alone had 5,000 such mills and constructed housing. They also introduced to Spain underwear and bathing with soap. Their public baths numbered in the thousands, when bathing in the rest of Europe was frowned upon as a diabolical custom to be avoided by all good Christians. Poor hygiene contributed to the plagues in the rest of Europe. Moorish monarchs dwelled in sumptuous palaces, while the crowned heads of England and France and Germany lived in barns lacking windows, toilets, and chimneys, with only a hole in the roof as the exit for the smoke. Cordova in the 10th century was very much like a modern city of today. The streets were well paved for miles, and there were raised sidewalks. At night you could walk without fear for 10 miles, and by the light of lamps that flanked by the buildings, and was hundreds of years before there was anything like that in Paris or in London. The population of just one of these cities was over 100 million, and there were 200,000 homes, 800 public schools, many colleges and universities, thousands of palaces of the wealthy, besides the royal palaces surrounded by beautiful gardens. The city was teeming with vibrant life. There were 5,000 mills, and at that time there was not even one in the rest of Europe. There were 900 public baths, as I said before. Europe was considered bathing extremely wicked, yet there was cleanliness brought to Europe. During the 9th and the 10th centuries in the capital city of Cordova in Spain, the Moors cultivated the arts and the sciences, as well as the standards of etiquette and sanitation. Education was made mandatory by the Moors, while 90% of Europe, as I said, was illiterate, including the kings and the queens. So we have played a role in giving Europeans knowledge, power, and understanding. But when we allowed them to know the secrets of gunpowder, it turned around and met our demise over a period of time. Now let me see, we're going further in this study. I want you to understand that the pain of what we have gone through in the middle passage and the pain we experience in looking at what has happened to us, you can turn that pain into power. You see, when you understand how your mind works and understand that everything around you was a thought before it became physical reality, and everything beyond that at a lower level is energy, then you can take the energy of your pain and turn it around for power and passion to move forward in the present, to be able to do what you need to do in the present to secure the future. Now, let me take a look at this. The British, during the captivity under the Japanese soldiers, they made their soldiers look at what the Japanese was doing to them. What the Germans did to the Jews study that. And they never let their people forget that. They have institutions that have studied all of what happened to them, and they teach their children. And how much more we need to do that ourselves, so that we can recognize what we're facing in this world. Many times it's not so much the devil that we're facing, it's other people that are doing things to us. But listen to some of the statistics of what's happening to us today. In 1974, the number of Americans incarcerated in all state prisons stood at 187,500. By 1991, the number had reached 711,700. Nearly two-thirds of all state prisoners in 1991 had less than a high school education. That's why we need to educate our own, because over 50% of our children are not graduating from high school. And when you don't have an education, when you don't have intelligence, when you don't have knowledge, then you can be, in mass, you can be guided and directed into things that cause you to be put in prison over time. So incarceration rates by the end of the 1980s had soared to an unprecedented level, especially for black Americans. As of December in 1989, the total U.S. prison population, including federal institutions, exceeds 1 million for the first time in history. An incarceration rate of the general population of 1 out of every 250 citizens. For African Americans, the rate was over 700%, over 700 out of 100,000, or 7 times more than that for whites. about 1/2 of all prisoners in prisons in America are black. 23% of all black males in their 20s were either in jail or in prison or on parole or probation or awaiting trial. The rate of incarceration of black Americans in 1989 has surpassed that experienced by blacks who are still living under apartheid or were still living under apartheid in the regime of South Africa. So if we do not come together to educate our children, if we do not give them the benefit of good self-esteem by knowing what they have done in the past and what we have contributed to the world's on the world stage of events, then other people will not respect us, since we don't respect ourselves enough to tell the truth. And quite frankly, when we're looking at the Bible, we're looking at somebody else's idea or history of us. Many times what's written in the Bible by other people about us is derogatory, such as we've been brought into a curse, we're a cursed people. Now these are written by people who didn't mean any good to us or for us, yet we celebrate that information and put ourselves down. So it is time for us to have a thinking gospel where we think with our minds and be able to evaluate information. And many times what we find in the biblical text is not correspondent to what we find in history. When they were putting the Jews in the ovens, I didn't see anybody come and stand as a fourth person in the oven so that they could say, oh, it looks like the Son of God in the ovens. No, they got burned up. And when the Indians were living and they knew about the Spirit of the living God and were living as if they were in a kingdom come to earth, they were still decimated. No, it's power, it's gunpowder, it's guns, and it's Bibles that have met our demise. And so we need an education, a re-education of ourselves, because we are losing our children to incarceration. We're losing them to ignorance. And not only that, but listen to this. The vast majority of these new prisoners were non-violent offenders, and many of these were convicted of drug offenses that carried long prison terms. As a matter of fact, crime was going down at the time that they instituted this new war on drugs. And it's really not a war on drugs. It's a war on black and brown people. Now, since we don't discuss that, since we don't talk about that, we're oblivious to that. And when you're living in a church realm and a church understanding, you're living in a bubble that does not allow you to see what's actually happening to you. In other words, you're deaf, dumb, and blind. Now, I'm not downing churches for what they do. Yes, we need salvation. Yes, we need the power of God. But we need to think beyond just what is given to us between Genesis and Revelation. We can be multidimensional. We do not have to be a monolithic group that only studies spirituality, that has us on our way to heaven, and we don't even know what's going on around us. Now listen to this. There are 1,153 babies born to teen mothers, 1,672 public school students that are corporally punished, 1,879 babies that are born without health insurance, 2,261 high school students that drop out of high school, 2,383 children are confirmed as abused or neglected, 2,400 babies are born into poverty, 2,494 babies are born to mothers that are not high school graduates, 4,017 babies are born to unmarried mothers, 4,300 children are arrested, 17,132 public school students are suspended. These numbers just don't affect African Americans, they affect all of our communities. So if we, as those of us who call ourselves Christians and Muslims and whatever your religious persuasion, do not start talking about what's really happening to us, and we're always talking about what happened 2,000 years ago or 6,000 years ago or in Genesis and Revelation, then we're not going to be able to address the problems of today. So if you've missed any part of this broadcast, you can write me at Post Office Box 1253, Pine Bluff, Arkansas, 71613, 1253. And I invite you again to listen to The Power of the Change. This is the last broadcast that we're going to have for this year about African history, and we're going to move into how to understand yourself and understand the world and elevate your consciousness to a higher place in God. God bless you this week. Enjoy the blessings of God all around you at all times and give Him the glory.